I'm going to get going. I wanted to actually start with a bit of a personal introduction, just so that I can set the stage. My paycheck comes from you, the people. I work for U.S. Department of Agriculture, and my job is to identify problems that are associated with nutrient management, and then to work in the process of trying to fix them. And some of these are giant problems. That's what we've heard from so far. And so my talk today is focusing on agricultural sources of phosphorus in an environment right now that's highly politicized, in which the tendency is actually to kind of entrench in perspectives. And it's the opposite tendency that I've had in my recent years. So I've been at this for about 20 years looking at phosphorus, and I feel that we need to be in the middle, and we need to be very honest about what our assumptions are, and we have to be honest about the uncertainty that's associated with all of our perspectives. So we drop the agenda as much as possible. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm not going to talk about policy because I can't do that as a government worker, but I do want to get in the middle, and I want people to think a little bit about what I do for a career and then what I'm going to present to you. So I focus on phosphorus. I pretty much focus on phosphorus only, and I work very hard with a crew of folks to deliver tools. One of the areas that I can't talk about today because it wasn't my mandate is manure management and manure injection. So I own as many manure injectors probably as any researcher on the face of the planet right now. I have a DSI Ag injector. I have a Yetter Avenger. I have a Veenhoos I just imported from the Netherlands. I have Airway. I have Subsurfer. These are great technologies that from my perspective, I brought them in because they give farmers options for managing their manures, but they create issues for a farmer. So if I go to recommend them, it's going to take a farmer twice as long to spread his manure. Somebody who's not empathetic to that perspective will say, well, we'll just pay him a little more. But there's one guy, he's built an entire system. Manure management, phosphorus management is not central to his perspective, and now he has to adopt that. So have a little bit of empathy there. We're asking farmers to ship litter around places, to ship manure around the country. It makes sense from this macro perspective, but that's not something that they've done in the past. And in fact, they've used that resource to great benefit in the past. So think about some of the decisions that we make as you look at this and as I focus in on some of the ag issues. During the break, I got in line with everybody else to go to the bathroom. I could have, as somebody who works on phosphorus, I could have decided to hold it, wait until after today, and drive over to Ocean City or someplace and go there. And at that point, I'd be at least, I'm going to pollute from that very process. A little bit of that phosphorus that comes out is going to pollute in that process. And so that is clearly an unreasonable demand. I'm drinking coffee right now. I'd prefer to be drinking a Coke Zero. It helps me keep svelte. I like that little piquant kind of finish to it. That piquant finish comes from phosphoric acid that's been added to that drink. Now, I could decide not to do that. I should go with a coffee if I'm making my decision solely based upon phosphorus management, but I don't. I prefer that 12 ounces of the Diet Coke. I'm not making a decision based upon phosphorus there. So as we look to the agricultural community and we think of what we're using as common sense, I think we have to be very, very cautious about that, and there's a need for empathy. But this applies also to folks who are farming. Okay, so today I broke up the talk into 3 different sections. The first one is this kind of empathy. Let's look a little bit at the guys who've been managing phosphorus and think about food production over time and phosphorus fertility. It's an incredible success story that we have there. And so that's going to give us some insight into how we actually have created some problems from a water quality perspective. And then let's look at soil and manure, not as resources so much, but as things that can create a problem. But they are our resources that we're managing. Okay, so to take a step back, we are constantly in a development stage. Development is not over. We talk about the developed world and the developing world, but we are always adapting. None of our systems are optimized for all of the problems that face society. So Merton talks about the law of unintended consequences. We go out there and we fix one thing and we screw something else up. That's what humans do. And so we have overcome one of the fundamental inequalities that exists in nature, and that is when you stick phosphorus out in the environment, it wants to stick to soil and bind to soil, and it doesn't give a rip if you want to grow a crop right there. So if you look at our soils around the world and you look at their potential to bind that soil, you see that in a lot of our most productive areas, and also where we reside right now, our soils have a tremendous capacity to bind that soil. We call that absorption process. And so there's certain minerals that contribute to that. We heard a little bit about this earlier from Walter. There's iron minerals contribute to that. Aluminum minerals contribute to that. In soils that are well lined, calcium minerals contribute to that. All those things help to bind up that phosphorus. And we have a perspective right now where we want them to stay bound. We want that phosphorus to stay bound. But in fact, to grow crops, we don't want that. We want some of that out there so that the crop can access it. So I apologize, I'm going to get into data, but that's what we do. We share data and all this. This is, if you get into phosphorus science, you read a bunch of Andrew Sharpley's papers, and then you start working with what we call the sorption isotherm. And so what we do is we take a soil sample and we expose it to different concentrations of phosphorus in solution. So we kind of fertilize it a little bit. And we get these very, very characteristic curves where what you see, let's see, do I have a pointer right here? So right here, this is the phosphorus that stays in water. This is actually the little cup of water that a plant drinks out of. And what you can see here is the axis goes up to about 25. There's only 15 parts per million in water. Of that phosphorus, we stick in, and most of it goes into the soil. So the majority of the phosphorus that we put out there in the environment ends up bound to the soil. It's this little amount right here that's become an incredible headache. The amount that stays in solution. We want it to be in solution to feed our crops. However, if it doesn't feed the crop, then it's there and it's available to runoff water. And so this illustrates that soils have different capacities to bind that. And good agricultural management, we want to reduce that buffer for that capacity. That's how the Cerrado of Brazil became this breadbasket for soybean production. They went in and they put lime and they put phosphorus fertilizer in there and they changed the economy of an entire nation through that process. And they brought their soils from this type of highly buffered soil to one that's like that. So it's a fundamental part of our agricultural development, and we cannot produce food for large numbers of people without overcoming that buffer capacity. And the reason why we've got to do that is that phosphorus doesn't travel very far in general. In general, phosphorus stays very close to the soil particles around which it is. So these are travel distances to a root. The roots generally have to grow to the phosphorus. It's only a couple of millimeters right there. We're talking about 1/10 of an inch is where the crops are getting their phosphorus. So think about managing that as a farmer. You've got to go out there and apply your fertilizers, but you've got to get them to the roots. And roots don't grow up to where we reside, they grow down. So that's difficult, and we've had a lot of advances in technology that help to move the fertilizers there. Other things like nitrogen, well, okay, they can diffuse more through the soil, they're not as reactive. But phosphorus is incredibly sticky, and so we're working to try to make it available to our crops. Okay, so that was kind of that was my chemistry lesson right now. So now I'm going to move more to an applied area, which is essentially an unsexy topic area that has to become sexy again, that needs massive societal investment in it. This is the fertilizer response curve, the classic fertilizer. And so on this axis, on the x-axis here, we have a measure of the amount of phosphorus in the soil. It's in parts per million. It's mellic-repeat. It's the same thing that Frank and Josh say is the FIV, more or less. And then we have the relative yield of corn. We have kind of a maximum here of 100. And so what you see is a kind of a diminishing return. The higher concentration of phosphorus is in the soil, you certainly get increases in yield, but eventually the thing plateaus. Now, this is one data set from 2003. This is the most recent published data set that I could find from our colleagues on this subject. Antonio Mallarino, who did this out in Iowa. If you want to look at what Doug Beagle has, who's my counterpart on this up in Pennsylvania, most of his data are from 20, 30 years ago, and they reside either on his computer or in his file. They're not available for folks to go out and make those recommendations just because of the time at which they were produced. We didn't have big data initiatives at the time. So these guys are working with finite data sets, and then they're making recommendations. This is the interpretation. This is a very low soil test phosphorus. This is low. This is optimum. This is high, very high. And we have different thresholds. They've gone in there and they've considered various things in terms of the resource return, and they've decided, and this is very consistent, that somewhere around 15 to 20 melic 3 phosphorus right there, you're in the optimum, but really because there's the potential to draw that down, you want to be managing more up in that area. So this is just one example. It's a relationship that's derived from the old-fashioned colorimetry or spectrophotometer that those of us who took a little bit of chemistry in college used. So when Antonio goes out and develops the same relationship with the ICP, this is a different kind of spectrophotometer, and I have 2 of them paid by you. Okay, these are awesome. They allow the soil testing labs to look at multiple elements at the same time, great improvements in efficiency and all that. But what you see now is that we get actually different numbers. Okay, so there's some differences there. So guys who run soil testing lab go out there and make correlations, spend a lot of time, but this is loosey-goosey, okay? We've got these thresholds here, there's noise in this response then, we have different types of curves that come with different instruments here. The lab issues go on, as do the field issues. So that was just for corn. So now let's look at making recommendations for multiple crops. These are just the modeled results right here. These aren't even the data that are there. But what you can see here are common commodities that are grown in rotation is that they have different demands. The optimum amount is not the same for each one of these. So as you go out there and you start talking about how much phosphorus is too much phosphorus, it starts to get complicated. There's a number of variables that you have to consider. Here also, this relationship uses something other than the melic one. Some guy named Bray wanted to have his name associated with the test. And so you have to account for that. So we have inherently this uncertainty that's built into our recommendations. These recommendations have been repeated by very fine scientists around the country and around the world, and they all kind of, settle around some type of a mean, but there's definitely noise in there. They were made with the consideration of agronomic production, basically production of crops as the priority factor. They were not made with environmental concerns as the priority factor. So decisions on where those thresholds were had more to do with risk from the standpoint of a farmer. If you underapply right here, what's the potential that you're going to get a little phosphorus deficiency in the early season? They didn't have to do with what's the potential that phosphorus is going to be released to the environment. And so there is a real need for us to pool those data. So now I'm just using this opportunity to kind of shamelessly plug something. And follow on the heels of what they've done in Australia. This was led by the IPNI, which is actually a fertilizer-sponsored group, the International Plant Nutrition Institute. And we actually have a member right here. They brought together all kinds of folks from universities, from industry and all that, and they essentially pooled their data, made them open, and made common judgments that you can go into this system and see that. And that's the type of thing that has to happen here, because otherwise it seems like it's all cloakroom types of decisions. And there's also opportunities for people to make recommendations that really aren't based on good science. And that certainly happens. That's out there. We talked a little bit about that earlier. The other thing is we find when we go through these types of programs, we get tremendous buy-in, not just from the environmental community, but also from the agricultural community. So Lake Erie right now, they're in tremendous pressure because of what happened in Toledo last summer. And they have a 4R initiative where there's voluntary certification of retailers, service providers, various professionals that's basically intended to say, yes, I'm an environmental steward and I'm going through best practice on this. And I'm not trying to advocate for voluntary versus, regulated. I'm just saying that these types of initiatives can actually attract folks and change the way recommendations are generated. And so I think there are real opportunities for us to go out there and improve the way that we deliver our recommendations. So let's flip now to an environmental perspective. So this is a map that basically shows agronomic imbalance, where we have surplus. So basically, yellow or red, we've got surpluses. It's kind of a crude map, but you see China is red, and that's not just because of communism. That's because of the fact that they've had a national policy to build up their soil fertility so that they can be self-sufficient in their production of their food. You look at our region right here, we're a hot spot. This has to do with all kinds of forces. Andrew talked about this to some degree earlier. Economics drives it, geopolitics drives it. And it's reflected in our farming systems. And this is an undeniable fact. This is a systemic type of an issue that is incredibly hard for any single farmer to address. This has to do with the way our cropping systems have evolved and become more intensified and more specialized over time in order for that farm to remain competitive. And so when you look at county level phosphorus balances, all you have to know is that the darker ones here are where we have very, very large imbalances. We have a lot more phosphorus coming into those counties than what's leaving at the end of the year. You see hot spots in our region. Not a new story. So you go out and you actually ask your colleagues for some soil test data, and you can see hot spots again down in North Carolina, in Maryland, in Delaware. And those hot spots tend to be associated with livestock production. And that is that we have a dissociation of our livestock production and our crop production. And so our livestock are getting food that's coming not necessarily locally. I mean, it's coming oftentimes from places like the Midwest. So if you look at Delaware, this is from Tom Sims, 1998. Same story today. 3 counties, very simple state in terms of the number of counties. You can keep track of them. I think that's Kent in the middle. And the county that has the dairy production, the majority of the soils that went through the soil testing lab that year were low in terms of the phosphorus. The county that had poultry, the predominance of poultry, were high. This has to do with the different nature of these production systems. These tended to be smaller operations, higher densities of animals. But you can see that that's associated not with an individual farm, but with a system. This is an individual farm. This is where I did my PhD when I was at Cornell. In the New York City watershed is a dairy farm, and this is the kind of thing that you can work with a farmer on. So dairy farm had very low number of animals relative to the land area, but wherever you saw high soil phosphorus, that was just near the barn. Okay. So this is the kind of thing that over time you can get him to better distribute the manure with. Okay, even under a best case scenario, we end up with a phosphorus problem. So we push farmers to manage for nitrogen, and unfortunately the manures are kind of sloppy fertilizers. They don't come in perfect kind of ratios in terms of the nitrogen and phosphorus. You put a lot more phosphorus on the soil than what you need if you apply, even in a best case situation, which used to be the nitrogen. So here's what you get if you apply these different types of manures on a nitrogen basis. And this is just kind of a book value thing based upon a survey that we did a few years ago. And then here's what a corn crop is going to remove. So you can see that even with really good management right there, where you're really focused on the nitrogen needs of the crop, you're going to over-apply. And over time, that's going to build up in those soils. So there's some things that are inherent kind of just overlooked issues that end up biting us in the butt. But there are also things that the industry has taken head on for various reasons and shown great, great advances in. And I think this is one of my favorite ones to show right here. If you look at what's happened in terms of the excretion of nutrients, so this is essentially an efficiency type of an issue right here. You can see that over time, we've had some dramatic reductions in the nitrogen and phosphorus that are fed to poultry and then come out the tailpipe. And in fact, if you look at the Delmarva, and this is after phytase was first introduced, you're continuing to see reductions in that the amount of feed that's being excreted by single birds. So this is really changing the story in terms of the accumulation of nutrients. We can get more efficient, and there's still strides, still gains to be made. So we go out there and we apply phosphorus either purposely or inadvertently at different rates. What we see is that essentially the more you add, this is work that Andrew did, the more you add in the soil, the more it accumulates there, even if you're taking some off of crops. And so at the highest rate, which is 100 pounds per acre right here roughly, this is what he got after a decade. You could see it was half that at half the rate, and then this is the control with no manure added right there. What I want you to take home here is that they're applying this over time, and where it's accumulating is right up at the surface, what we call the effective depth of interaction between soil and runoff water. And it's this little lens right here that nobody really gives a rip about. That's not what we're managing. This little veneer of soil is the principal source of phosphorus to most of the runoff that we see. Okay, so let me just finish on the side of the fertility. These are some things I think we all agree with. Long-term stewardship of phosphorus is everyone's concern. You don't hear anyone counter that. I think we need transparent fertilizer recommendation systems that everyone can see and be comfortable with. And they certainly are going to move us so that we can account for a lot of the new varieties that we have that are much higher yielding than they were in the past. And then the recycling. This is a very difficult area. Okay, I'm getting to soils now. And this is the middle now. This is the paradox, and this is what gets my NRCS colleagues kind of up in a tizzy when you start talking about no-till and trade-offs, or if you start talking about cover crops and trade-offs. So Andrew did some very nice work in late 80s, early 90s, where he basically did a paired watershed study. He had a couple of watersheds that were managed for wheat production, and that he monitored them, saw what came out the other side, what came out the outlet. Sorry, what you see is the total amount of phosphorus, so this is sediment-bound phosphorus and dissolved phosphorus, stayed roughly the same with conventional till wheat. And the dissolved phosphorus didn't change really that much with conventional till wheat. In the other watershed, the first few years it behaved the same. They were both in conventional till wheat, and then they implemented no-till, and you had a 95% reduction in erosion. So this is one of the great reasons for adopting no-till right there. And what you saw was basically a concomitant reduction in the total amount of phosphorus that was lost there. A great phosphorus success story, but that's not the end of it. Part of the story is that the dissolved phosphorus actually went up over time. And we talked a little bit about vertical stratification. I'll get a little bit more into that. So look at the concentrations here. Total phosphorus goes up to 6 right there. Dissolved goes up to 1. So the dissolved thing is it's a minority of the total phosphorus that's coming out. However, it still can be an issue. So these are the kinds of complexities then that make recommendations on a phosphorus conservation basis kind of difficult. Here's something that's a little less difficult. The more phosphorus in the soil, the more phosphorus runs off in runoff. You're going to hear more about that later. But phosphorus also leaches. Trying to convince people that phosphorus leaches is one of these most aggravating things, since Andrew's been writing about it since the 70s in New Zealand. It's not a new finding, but it happens on the Delmarva. It happens in Lake Erie. It's not a surprise. It's just a surprise to people who haven't gone into the Journal of Production Ag or Journal of Environmental Quality and read Andrew's paper from 1981, which probably none of you have. So this is from where we work on the Delmarva. Art Allen was part of this. It's a really, really excellent study. A number of colleagues were part of it. We sampled soils that were primarily on poultry operations, but some of them were on row crop operations from up and down the Delmarva Peninsula. And then we basically looked at leaching through these intact soils, how phosphorus leached out the bottom. And we sampled the top of these columns to see what phosphorus was in them. And we found these kinds of relationships. And I won't go too far into it because I've really been yammering here. But here's that soil test P. It's kind of related. There's a threshold about 200 where all of a sudden, leaching becomes a concern. But here's soil P saturation. A number of folks in the audience here have advocated that we use this. It includes not only a measure of the amount of phosphorus, but basically what's in the soil that would also bind it. And what you see there is that the relationship is much cleaner, that you get a very, very clear threshold with this particular way of measuring soil phosphorus. And so there are ways of improving upon the agronomic measure right there. This can be determined from the iron aluminum that's also collected with the milk. This is one of the good news stories that's out there. Frank Cole's been pushing this very hard. Okay, so I want to get into vertical stratification because this is the headache. This is in the middle. This is the kind of thing where you end up raining on people's parade, where a great practice like no-till can have some inadvertent consequences, some inadvertent consequences. So we're in the Lake Erie watershed again, where dissolved phosphorus is the principal concern, and dissolved phosphorus loading to Lake Erie is the principal concern. Colleagues from Heidelberg University did this study, really excellent study. In Lake Erie, what we saw was that in the mid-90s, you started to have an uptick of dissolved. That was, I think Andrew referred to that earlier. That's coincident with the expansion of no-till there. And so the concern is that if you're not going out there and cultivating the ground, mixing the ground up, that we apply phosphorus to the surface and it can build up in the surface. And remember what I said about the EDI, that effective depth of interaction. That's the source of phosphorus to run off. So these colleagues went out and just did a soil sampling and kind of they simulated tillage with their soil sampling. So here's a typical agronomic sample. They're going down to 8 inches right there. These are all the same soil pretty much. The average concentration that they got was 36, right low. When they stratify these, when they actually cut their cores up into different bits, what you can see is that 36 is composed of a 60 there, it's composed of a 49 here, 34, and 26. When you mix those all together, you get that 36. And so this is not reflected in a typical agronomic sample right there, but it also points to the fact that even though this watershed is not in continuous no-till for the most part, it has very little continuous no-till, that we have some very, very good accumulation of phosphorus at the surface. That's an unintended consequence. Okay, now this is to continue to rain on the win-win situation. This comes from Doug Smith, and I didn't have time to kind of transcribe the data, so they're not that clear. But basically, Doug, when he was in Indiana, looked at corn yield that was associated either with soil samples that were 2 inches deep or that were 2 to 8 inches deep. And when you looked at the surface, so the 2-inch, think of that, that's the environmentally sensitive area. When you look at that relationship at the surface, soil test phosphorus against corn yield, there's no relationship. And that has to do with what I showed you earlier, those plant roots growing down and the roots basically accessing phosphorus deeper in the soil. But you do see a relationship with the deeper sample right there. So this says that some of the tools that we use, such as just regular soil testing for agricultural purposes, may not be sensitive to some of the things that are giving us a headache from an environmental standpoint. Okay, so my take-home points here for soil phosphorus, you got to get erosion control in place. Otherwise, you're going to have trouble. But it's not the only thing that we have to tackle. We have to address this headache of dissolved phosphorus. And this is where a lot of us focus our research on because of that. And vertical stratification is a big, big problem. Okay, so let's move to manures, and then I'm going to wrap it up. And I've got, looks like 30 more minutes. That's great. Okay, so done a lot of work with manure, and you can tell when we're doing research because nobody wants to come to the Pasture Systems and Watershed Management Research Unit when we're working on manure extractions. But what we found was the amount of, if you take a manure sample and you put it in some water and you shake it and then you measure the amount of phosphorus in water, that's water-soluble phosphorus. We found that's a really good predictor of dissolved phosphorus that comes from soils that have been broadcast with manures. So we did a bunch of these studies and published them, all of it. It was really, kind of fun work. You're seeing here water-soluble phosphorus concentration in the applied source, dissolved phosphorus concentration in runoff water. Here's what the soil delivers alone without the manure sitting there on the surface. This is a worst-case scenario. We rain shortly after we apply the manure to the soils. And what we find then is, based upon the manures that we use, that we were getting these clustering of data. That the dairy tended to be a little lower, the poultry here. This has to do with the samples that we took and where we were getting them. But we've got these consistent relationships. So basically, the solubility of the phosphorus in the manure helps to control what is lost in runoff. That's the lesson we have there. So that's called the wash-off phenomenon or the incidental transfer phenomenon. And what it is it's the idea that when you go out there and you stick a soluble source on the surface, for a period of time, it's available to runoff water and it'll wash off. It's not a permanent phenomenon. These are model data right here. But what they show is that in this simulation, those early events before you apply the manure have background concentrations of dissolved phosphorus. And then after the manure is applied, you get a peak, and then that basically drops down over time. This is one of the reasons that people harp on the timing of manure application, because there is a change over time in the availability of that applied manure to runoff water, and it diminishes. And it doesn't diminish just in days. It takes usually weeks or months. Okay, so that was timing, now placement. And I didn't introduce the 4 R's because I'm not managing this talk terribly well right now, but these are all part of the 4R strategy that you're going to hear more about later. This is the beginning of the work that we did on manure injection. So we've had wonderful collaboration on manure injection. And the manure injection work that started here in the Chesapeake is now global. So we've looked at everything, not just phosphorus, but odor issues associated with nitrate leaching, ammonia volatilization, all the things that we thought would be trade-offs. We also looked at economics as well. And we imported things because we wanted to try to get manure off the surface, or if we were going to work it in, we didn't want to promote tillage. I know that's an issue here in Maryland right now with the current regs. And so these are some of the things that I mentioned earlier. We have the only version of this particular injector. It was invented in Norway with money from the King of Norway. That's all I can say about it. But it's sitting in a heap in the corner of one of our shops right now. I'm not advocating it. So what we find when we go out there, so each one of these data points right here is associated with a particular technology, is that depending on how much water extractable phosphorus is sitting on the surface after we go through and apply our manure, we get a relationship with the dissolved phosphorus loss. So should be common sense. You know, if you can stick the poop in the ground, it's not available to water that's washing off the surface. But it also shows great potential for technological solution to an environmental problem. Okay, so this, in some cases, is a win-win thing because actually we get improvements in nutrient use efficiency under some conditions. So this comes from work with Art Allen and his grad student Nancy Cheppeter at University of Maryland Eastern Shore. And what we saw consistently at this site, and almost this site alone, was that when you looked at the differences in the corn grain yield at their research farm, that when you applied manure, you got a little bump relative to no manure, and that when you incorporated it with kind of a subsurfer, I didn't really talk about that, but if you injected it more or less, you got even greater increase in yield. And so we saw that in 2008, we saw that in 2009. This is the kind of win-win thing that you want to just you want to shout out to everybody. We've repeated these studies with all kinds of manure injectors on livestock operations that for the most part probably don't need that improvement in nutrient use efficiency because they got plenty of nutrients floating around already. And we tend not to see the improvements in yield. And so that's a great disappointment. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't get them. It just means that on those sites, we don't get that win-win. So I think it's important not to oversell. I've learned a lesson from that. So I'm going to finish up too. I don't want to overstate this one. These are my last two slides right here. These are the cover crop trade-offs. And these are not new findings. Andrew was asked about this earlier on. We had a grad student when Andrew and I worked together who came from Norway who had been seeing in her watershed samples an increase in dissolved phosphorus that's associated with the growing of catch crops. He talked about them. So instead of calling them cover crops, they call them catch crops. And so she grew these catch crops different ways. And this is the way we do our science a lot of times. We have little columns of soil. And then we would yield these really heavy things in and out of the freezer. And we basically simulated the senescence and the breakdown of the plant tissue through freeze-thaw cycles. And what you see here is that water-soluble P that's associated with the rye catch crop increases with the number of freeze-thaw cycles. So this helps you to get into the mentality that these, which are essentially green manures, they can be a source of dissolved phosphorus. This is part of the trade-off thing. I don't want to overstate this. So then we did runoff work, and what we saw was that, before freezing, really, we had a benefit from the cover crop, if anything, and then after freezing, the cover crop became a liability. Okay, so we set this project up to really amplify these differences, but it points to the potential for cover crops to be a source of dissolved phosphorus. Done in the lab. This is my last slide. Don't worry, folks, and then you can wake up after this. This is a study that was done by the fine folks at Heidelberg University in collaboration with NRCS and some other organizations who are working in the Lake Erie area. And they took advantage of an initiative to promote BMPs. And the principal BMPs that were adopted were cover crops and winter wheat. So it's essentially kind of a cover crop testing. And there were two watersheds. Honey Creek was their targeted watershed, and then they had one that they didn't target. Honey Creek got this increase in the cover crops. Rock Creek was their control, and I've only used the stuff that I hope shows you the simplest kind of results. If you look at the sediment-bound phosphorus coming out of Rock Creek in green and Honey Creek in blue right here from 1996 to 2012, you can see that both of them are more or less kind of doing the same thing. Rock Creek maybe has a little bit more coming up, but they're basically tracking the same thing. This line right here is when the targeted watershed program went into effect. Here's dissolved phosphorus. So that's the concentration of sediment-bound phosphorus. Here's the dissolved phosphorus. This is what we'd expect to impact by putting a green manure out there in the environment. And look at what starts to happen after the implementation of the targeted watershed program. You start to see an increase in honey creep in the dissolved phosphorus concentrations. And this is the very problem they're facing in Lake Erie. So Lake Erie has very low loads of phosphorus coming in, but they're enough to trigger these cyanobacterial blooms. And this is, unfortunately, one of the trade-offs that comes with us trying to fix one problem and then creating, unfortunately, the dissolved phosphorus problem. So my take-home point there is that we got to lead with the 4 R's if we're worried about manures, but we have to consider the trade-offs. And so that's the end of my talk. I apologize for going over. I just talked about the source side. Tony Buddha now is going to talk about the transport.